glass of wine. The moon was burning bright with you standing by my side. You weren't lonely, neither was I. But the energy between us made our worlds collide. I won't let a moment go by. I won't let you out of my sight. You give me that high. Every day since that vacation night when we danced on top of the bar in Curacao. Feeling that body, your hands all over me. Up all night, down under the stars in Curacao. Feeling that body, your lips all over me. Like na 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 na, going too far, yeah. Na 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 na, back to the start when we fell in love at a bar in Curacao. So we sip that champagne on ice, talking under the sky. So we moved our bodies all night, swimming under the sky. Moved our bodies all night, so connected, more than desire. Jumped into the water cause we started a fire. Your perfection, changing my mind. We're so good together like it's by design. I won't let a moment go by. I won't let you out of my sight. You give me the high. Every day since that vacation night when we danced on top of the bar in Curacao. Feeling that body, your hands all over me. Up all night, down under the stars in Curacao. Feeling that body, your lips all over me. Like na 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 na, going too far, yeah. Na 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 na, back to the start when we fell in love at a bar in Curacao. When we danced on top of the bar in Curacao. Up all night, down under the stars in Curacao.
Muy buenas noches, tengan todos ustedes y agradecerles otra vez que estén aquí con nosotros en estos seminarios organizados por el Centro para el Futuro de las Ciudades. Pero en esta ocasión, y solamente hago esta introducción en español porque después nos vamos a pasar, o yo me voy a pasar al inglés, en esta ocasión con el Wilson Center. Entonces,
welcome everyone. We're very glad to welcome you here.
I think that we do a joint webinar between the Center of the Future of the Cities of the TEC de Monterrey and the Wilson Center. We are very happy for this to happen. And why don't you give us also an introduction? This is something that we used to do like every 15 days. We're coming back again a little bit late in the starting of the year, but very happy because this is our first webinar of this year, and this is gonna take place with you with the Wilson Center.
Thank you, Enrique, and thank you everybody for this opportunity. We're delighted to partner with you, Enrique, and with the Centro as well, and with TEC de Monterrey. The Wilson Center, for those who maybe aren't familiar with us, was founded by the U.S. Congress in 1968 as the living memorial to President Wilson, who was the only U.S. president with a PhD. And the purpose of the Wilson Center really is to try to connect those two aspects of Wilson's life, the academic and scholarly with the policy making, in order to try to help address difficult issues. And I think certainly cross-border water and climate change qualify as difficult issues that we need to address together. The Wilson Center has both regional and thematic programs, regional programs like the Mexico Institute, which I direct, and thematic programs like the Environmental Change and Security Program, which my colleague Lauren Reese directs. And it is in fact our ability to look at issues from different perspectives that we see as an important strength of the Wilson Center. So we're happy to be collaborating within the Wilson Center as well as with you at Tec de Monterrey. I think this is going to be an incredibly interesting and important conversation. I know we'll talk about and compare notes and thoughts about some of these challenges. I think it's probably fair to say that water is either a great opportunity for cross-border cooperation between the United States and Mexico, or potentially a future point of conflict. And I think we all hope it is the former and not the latter. So thank you again, Enrique. We're delighted to be here. Really looking forward to the conversation. I think you may be muted, Enrique.
Sorry, you're right. I was saying that we just had a meeting probably like 3 months ago in Washington. And after that conversation and another one that we had through Zoom, but it was a private one, is that we can organize this first webinar. And I hope this is the first of many. And as you were saying, I think one of the most relevant themes that we're now facing today in the world, and of course in our relationship between the US and Mexico, is precisely water, and also the implications that it has in climate change, but also in climate security. And for this purpose, we have invited, you have invited, we both have invited, on the one hand, Robert Varady, that he will be, as we have done in some other times, we're going to be giving Robert some 10 minutes for him to give a presentation. And then we're also going to be giving another 10 minutes to Lucero Radonich, so that she can also give a presentation. And then we'll be having comments from Laureen Herser. And this is the way we usually start. We first listen to the experts, to their presentations, and then we open this for discussion from the public. So as we have done in the past, if you permit me, I would like to introduce Robert, and I will just read a very short reference for him. Robert Varady is Research Professor of Environmental Policy and immediate past director of the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy at the University of Arizona, fellow member International Water Resources Association, adjunct research professor of arid land studies in the School of Natural Resources and the Environment, and adjunct professor in the Department of Hydrology and Atmospheric Sciences. His work mostly has addressed environmental and water management governance and policy in arid regions, with an emphasis on transboundary issues, especially along the US-Mexico border, which of course is of our concern. He has studied the history of global water initiatives, transboundary aquifer governance, and water security in the Americas. He has been a consultant at UNESCO, the FAO, and the GEF on a number of water-related efforts, and led an evaluation of UNESCO's World Water Assessment Program. Robert, we're very happy to have you here, and you have the floor for the next 10 minutes.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be making this presentation. And of course, it is in line with my own personal interests, my academic interests. So let me share my screen and we'll move to the PowerPoint presentation. Okay. Can you all see the presentation? Good. So the title that I've given this talk is Hydro Diplomacy on the US-Mexico border, and it'll be a very broad journey through what's a rich and long history. And I can't really do this full justice in the 10 minutes that I'm allocated. So think of it as a very condensed, very distilled version of the topic. And there's more on this if you like. Turning to the next slide, you'll see that although I put my name on this as the presenter, this is really the product of the work of a lot of different people who are colleagues of mine. And I've put up just 3 here that I'll go through very quickly. The first is a piece of work that we completed a year ago that I was the lead editor of. We put out a special issue of the journal Environmental Science and Policy on the topic hydro diplomacy in the US, I'm sorry, the hydro diplomacy everywhere. And in it, there is one paper that was led by my colleague Margaret Wilder on the topic that I'm speaking on today, which is the subject of hydro diplomacy on the US-Mexico border. Then last summer, 3 colleagues, including myself, put together an article for a journal called The Conversation, which has very wide distribution and gets picked up by newspapers and publications and other media. And that one was called Mega Drought Along the Border. And what we looked at there is the effects of the current, basically 20-year drought on relations between the US and Mexico. And that article has drawn about 85,000 views. So it was quite well received. The final thing is something that I participated in along with 11 other colleagues from multiple universities, and it was a white paper that we just submitted 3 weeks ago to the US Commissioner of the International Boundary and Water Commission. And it was done on request because there is a relatively new commissioner, and she wanted to know what a range of academics would suggest to her to do on behalf of the commission. What kinds of directions should she pull the commission in? So since I call this hydro diplomacy, what do I mean by hydro diplomacy? Well, let's go back and let's talk about science diplomacy very briefly, which is simply the use of science in diplomacy to prevent conflicts and crises. Then people refer to the term water diplomacy, which is the idea that you can apply diplomacy to problems that deal with water that crosses international borders. And finally, hydro diplomacy is sort of a combination of the two. It's when we feel the strong presence of science and a robust role for formal institutions in diplomatic processes that involve water. So to talk about this, I need to give you a little bit of background on the border, and I'll go through this very quickly because I think many of you already know these things, but the US-Mexico border is characterized physically by being water scarce across most of it. The landscape tends to be rugged, it tends to be fragile, and it's rich in wildlife and vegetation. There are 2 major rivers, the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, which you see on the right part of your screen, and the Colorado River Basin, which is on the left part. The first, the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, constitutes the border for much of it. The other one crosses the border. In addition to that, there are a number of important transboundary aquifers that provide groundwater. Turning to the socio-political characteristics of the border, it's generally thinly populated except for about 15 pairs of cross-border cities. The mainstays economically have been copper mining, agriculture, and ranching. And over the last several decades, the border region has experienced a lot of growth in population, in urbanization, and in economic development. And all the while, there have been tremendous asymmetries of wealth, power, and influence, and that has affected the economies of the 2 countries, the culture and the legal systems, the administration, politics, all of which are variously exhibit these asymmetries. Over the years, there have been multiple cycles of conflict and accommodation, and here I'll turn to the comments of Dr. Rudman, who pointed out that hopefully we like to talk about cooperation. And in fact, that is a theme of this talk. The major issues of contention on the border, not water related, have had to do with labor and migration and narco trafficking, as everybody knows. So let's turn to the actual diplomacy. The thing that prompted this work was that back in 2018, we were looking ahead and thinking that, boy, 2019 is going to be the 75th anniversary of a very important treaty between the two countries, the 1944 Water Treaty, which covered the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, Colorado, and Tijuana rivers. And that treaty anchors the bilateral relationships between the two countries. And importantly, it induces a kind of parity between the two sides in regard to issues related to water. All of the water disputes that have arisen have been addressed peacefully and diplomatically. And this is where an important word comes up, flexibility. And the flexibility is reflected in 145 specific agreements that have been adopted in regard to the treaty. And these are called minutes. So the treaty itself provided for a constant revision of itself through this procedure of adopting minutes. The minute process is extremely useful in places where the treaty had nothing to say or if it was vague. So it provides a kind of adaptability for long-term compliance through short-term flexibility. And what it does is it allows for new ideas to be brought into it, not the least of which is climate change, which no one talked about 78 years ago. So the treaty is flexible in that it allows minutes to deal with things like that. Here, I'm not going to go into all of this, but it's a timeline that we drew up for some of these presentations. And the only ones I'll call attention to is the first one, the US-Mexico Convention that created an International Boundary Commission, not water, but boundary, goes all the way back to 1889. So there's a long history of the two countries cooperating on boundary issues. Then, of course, the treaty itself in 1944, and from then to now, the constant adoption of minutes to that treaty. In 1983, there's a whole new set of agreements called the La Paz Agreement, the Reagan-Dela Madrid agreements, which I'll talk about briefly, that have to do with a broader view of environment, not just water. Then in 1994, a very important set of trade agreements through the North American Free Trade Agreement that led to the creation of some environmental institutions. Let's turn to the treaty itself, the 1944 Colorado River Treaty. And here are some observations. The treaty was negotiated after Mexico entered World War II. And in the US, one of the key elements of it is that it provided for the national interest to be more important than the ones in the states. And those of you who know how things work in the US, that's fairly unusual. In Mexico, it provided for the national interest to prevail over the interest of individual ministries. It was the first major bilateral treaty negotiated on de facto parity terms. That is to say that the two sides were essentially equal in terms of administering the terms of the treaty. The genius of that treaty was its fact-finding and dispute settlement mechanisms, and that allowed the treaty to help resolve problems that came up using both political and technical means. And that leads to the science diplomacy part, because the technical means involve doing studies and conducting research and incorporating that research into the treaty. At the same time that the treaty was negotiated and signed, it called for the creation of an International Boundary and Water Commission, which was an expansion of the original Boundary Commission. Some of the key minutes, and there were of course more than 100 as you saw, have to do with specific issues that arose. Like in the Colorado River Delta region, there was a big salinity problem. And so that dispute was resolved through a minute on salinity. Then there was a minute on transboundary sanitation, another one on ecological protection and restoration, particularly in the Colorado River, in the lower basin of the Colorado, and finally, the protection of the Tijuana River. The treaty that I alluded to, the 1983 La Paz Agreement, was different because it broadened the relationship. It broadened the agreement to issues beyond water. So it addressed environmental issues, not just water. It commits to information sharing. It expands the range of negotiations to 100 kilometers north and south of the border, whereas the International Boundary and Water Commission originally was limited to just the border itself, literally the border. It broadens the subject range to things that include non-transboundary water. It acknowledges all the same the leadership of the International Boundary and Water Commission for issues that have to do strictly with transboundary water. It recognizes the role of states, municipalities, and NGOs as stakeholders. And in doing that, it ushers in a different kind of governance, which is a multilateral kind where different entities have a role in deciding how things go. The 1994 NAFTA environmental institutions were unusual because there had never really been in the world a major trade agreement that included environmental provisions. So the outcomes of that were, one, a trilateral commission, which still exists, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, which includes Canada, the US, and Mexico. And it has a broad mandate of looking at environmental issues in any of the three countries. Then the special side accords that were negotiated at the same time as the treaty agreement, as the trade agreement, led to an environmental commission, the Border Environment Cooperation Commission, which was bilateral, US-Mexico, a development bank, the North American Development Bank. And in 2017, the two countries agreed to merge those two institutions so that the Environmental Commission is now part of the bank. So what are the diplomacy challenges facing the border? Well, sociopolitically, we're constantly facing population growth and chronic water shortages. And these water shortages are, of course, exacerbated by the prospect of climate change and global warming, which is especially felt in the border region. There is economic asymmetry and social inequality. And then there are political tensions that could hamper hydrodiplomacy. A good example of that, you'll see a picture in the middle there of soldiers. Not long ago, last fall, there was a serious dispute in the area not far from Monterrey because Mexico owed the United States quite a bit of water as part of the treaty. And that did not sit well with the local farmers who felt that the Mexicans were going to be giving away Mexican water, and it led to some difficult times that were eventually resolved. As far as climate goes, the region is warming more quickly than the global average. You can see an example of that is what we call the bathtub rings on one of the reservoirs of the Colorado River. And the variability and uncertainty is something that stresses the cooperation. So looking ahead, what are the effects of altered relationships on hydrodiplomacy? Well, we see that the treaty stabilizes the water relations and therefore it cushions political oscillations. If the treaty weren't there, it would be a lot more difficult for the two countries to deal with issues relating to water. Some of the tensions have to do with surface water, as the example I gave before on the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo. In the Colorado Delta region, there are Mexican suspicions of what the US might want to do. There's talk about, for example, putting in some desalination plants in the upper Gulf, which is at the mouth of the Colorado River. And Mexican interests tend to be suspicious of that. There is a lack of agreement on groundwater, and that's something that in the future is going to have to get addressed because groundwater is becoming a more and more important source for water on both sides of the border. some of the future points have to do with the better use of science, more effective technical integration, and more and better economic cooperation. And finally, we think that the region is poised to develop some sustainable alternatives, such as solar energy, but at the same time, they may pursue some less sustainable ones, like the example of desalination that I gave. So I'll stop right there and stop sharing my screen and turn it over back to the organizers. So thank you.
Well, Robert, first of all, thank you very much, because for some of us who are not experts in these issues, I think this has been very clarifying in terms of the origins of this relationship between the US and Mexico, how far away it goes, and the relevance of the different treaties that have been taking place. So I think it's a very good starting point to have the discussion, and also some of the issues that you have raised, no? And so I think that this is a very, very good opening. And let me now give the word so that we can continue with this presentation to Lucero Radonjic, PhD. She's assistant professor, environmental science and policy program from Michigan State University. Her research focuses on the intersections of water rights and infrastructure, the science and micropolitics of climate change, and the urbanization in Latin America and the US-Mexico borderlands. Through her work, she also seeks to expand the methods toolkit for social science research in human and environmental relations through engagement in interdisciplinary collaborations and methodological innovation. So Lucero, first of all, thank you very much for being here with us, and you have the floor for the next 10 minutes.
Thanks, Enrique. Let me share my screen here. There we go. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. It is a real pleasure to be here and be part of this conversation. Over the last 10 years, I have had the privilege to work on issues of water security, first through a regional emphasis that looked at large-scale infrastructure development and environmental policies, and more recently at the household level, so household water security, with emphasis on individual experiences and coping strategies. And overall, when we talk about water security, what we see a lot is that it is framed in terms of crisis and conflict, and understandably so, because it is a limited resource and there are competing interests from different groups. But as Robert Varady just shared with us today, water is not only a flashpoint, but it can also be a vehicle for cooperation. And in this short intervention today, what I want to do is to first highlight some emerging trends towards water security in cities that are based on cooperation. And I will do so by focusing on green infrastructure and sharing the story of one program, so rooting it down through one case study. And I will end by drawing attention to several things, but particularly to the practical importance of using an environmental justice framework for climate security. So the water sector, and this is just a tiny overview here, is, as we know, at the forefront of climate change. Water utilities in cities are already dealing with more frequent flooding that contaminates watersheds and creates problems for infrastructure. And we see in that picture of Mexico City problems with roads. They are also contending with extended droughts that reduce their water allocations. And we're already seeing that in the lower Colorado River Basin. And also with heat waves that increase demand and competition on water by multiple sectors. So as there is more heat in urban areas, for example, there is more need for AC. There is, by those households that actually have it, people may shower more, people may want to water their plants more because of evapotranspiration. So in general, more water demand. And we should also consider, even though this is harder to quantify thus far, is that cities and their utilities are likely to have to service more people resulting from climate change-induced displacement in the next decades. So in this context, there are some trends that I want to highlight that we see in the water industry. And I'm going to explain those as I go on. So this is just a list here. Transformation in our understanding of water security beyond guaranteed water supply. So we're starting to think more about security, not only about getting water, but how do you deal with extremes in a way that allows security and well-being. So extremes, too much water, too little water. Also, the transformation in the role and responsibilities of utilities in the water sector beyond provisioning just water for drinking and sanitation. In the US, we're seeing the emergence of what is being called a One Water framework. And I'll explain that in a minute. And also there's a growing call for climate equity. So in this context, green stormwater infrastructure, or GSI, which is one form in a broader suite of nature-based solutions, is considered an asset for the water industry. And it has the potential to help mitigate and adapt to climate change by harnessing precipitation to create an additional water source, by reducing flooding, or by promoting greenery, by capturing the water on site, and therefore help with heat mitigation. And as we think in the United States about the cost of upgrading infrastructure, green stormwater infrastructure becomes even more attractive. And I think too, as we think about cities growing, and not only in population, but incorporating new areas, the idea that this could be developed through this integration of gray, so traditional forms of infrastructure, and green infrastructure is very attractive. In the last decade, water utilities across the world, I'm talking here about the case of the US Southwest, but we see it in Australia, we see it in Europe, in Japan, and in the in Mexico too, in some towns, water utilities are expanded the role and responsibilities through the installation and management of GSI. Utilities are exerting a growing influence on how urban residents are differentially affected by climate change through the delivery of environmental benefits, such as extra water, runoff control, or increased shade. So this makes water utilities go beyond their traditional task to ensure that all residents have access to reliable and safe water supplies, which is already a very challenging task in low and medium income countries. So in this context, what we're seeing is also a shift in urban water management towards the One Water framework. And this entails integrated planning and implementation where drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, and surface water bodies are managed in collaboration and coordination by all of these different utility companies. So these subsectors that have traditionally operated in silos are beginning to coordinate when it comes to infrastructure construction, when it comes to funding. And there is different resources that are emerging on how to go about this integration. So let me land here and provide one case study. So here, let me put on my hat as an anthropologist to talk about this case in Arizona. So in 2012, the city of Tucson in Arizona, which you see there in the map, launched a residential rebate program for rainwater cisterns. So the program's objective was to develop rain and stormwater as supplemental water resources for landscape irrigation. And it had one eye towards urban heat mitigation through the landscaping part, and another eye towards water conservation through the part of creating an extra water source. Tucson, like most of the area that we call the greater Southwest, has been in a drought for 2 decades already. And for the last several years, it has been experiencing record-setting high average temperatures in the summer. Climate models for Tucson and the rest of the region are already projecting more days of extreme heat, so temperature that goes above 38.8 degrees Celsius, and basically less events of rain, but maybe more extreme precipitation. So it rains little, but when it rains, it pours. And to these, just briefly, we should also consider the urban heat island effect. So how cities are warming up more and not cooling during the day because of all of the impermeable surfaces. So going back to Tucson, thousands of households installed cisterns using the rebates. It was very successful in terms of implementation. And then an evaluation of the program found low participation from households in low income and minority neighborhoods, namely Mexican and Mexican American neighborhoods. Tucson has, if I remember the number right, about 35% of its population is Hispanic with roots in Mexico. In other words, what we were seeing was that middle and high income households were disproportionately benefiting from this program. So to make access more equitable, the utility created a second program offering zero interest loans and grants for low income households, as well as offering assistance in English and Spanish. So my team and I evaluated both programs and found several differences for why people were engaging with this form of infrastructure and how they managed it. In short, summing up here, we found that Anglo middle income households tended to want a desert oasis. Many of these households were people that had relocated to Tucson within the last 15 years from the Midwest. And they were learning the landscape and they wanted to plant drought adapted trees, shrubs, and cacti. You can see the picture there. In some areas, rainwater collection contributed to creating shade in public property too, making these pockets of cooling temperatures. And many of the houses that participated were able to decrease their water consumption, but others increased their water consumption as they didn't know how to manage rainwater systems and were not familiar with the needs and the physiology of desert plants. So in contrast, low-income Hispanic households who participated in the other program used rainwater as a source of irrigation for edible plant varieties principally. Many of these plants were plants that were from their native lands. So food production was a priority over shade. A majority of these participants had engaged in some rudimentary form of rainwater harvesting in the past. And for many of them, rainwater was associated with household water insecurity in their native countries. So it was associated with being excluded from the grid. So it also was a transformation of how they saw the infrastructure. But it was because of their past experiences that they had much more of a realistic assessment of the limitations and requirements for using rainwater at the household level. And this led to greater water savings. As a result, now the city is undergoing efforts to create educational materials for the different sectors of the population, and also creating funding schemes to develop and maintain neighborhood level green stormwater infrastructure for climate mitigation. So in this context, what I want to do is, if we consider that water security is climate security, I think just two important final remarks. One is the importance of applying a climate justice framework at its multiple scales. And what this means in very short is to consider who gets access to climate mitigation and adaptation strategies and their benefits. And how in looking at a much more and in a distribution that it's done through a lens of equity, we can reduce conflict. The other part is how can disenfranchised communities can be meaningfully incorporated in the planning and implementation of infrastructure and climate mitigation and water security. And this entails taking a step back and recognizing who those disenfranchised populations are. So thinking about the history of our areas, of our cities. And then finally, what can experts learn from on-the-ground practices? So that lens of recognition justice and recognizing what other people have been doing for a long time. With the case of rainwater harvesting, this is a low-tech, super simple technique that has been used by a long time. The other part that I think is important, and this is me and as an anthropologist, obviously I have to say this, is to consider the role of culture. People's relationship to water and to water infrastructure is diverse, and it's always mediated by culture. And by culture, I mean ethnicity, region of origin. Do people come from urban or rural livelihoods? Socioeconomic class? All of these different variables are important on how people will relate to water and will relate to infrastructure. So I think as we move forward, not only taking a technical approach, but really understanding these softer elements in our study of water security and climate security. Thank you. I'll conclude there.
Lucero, thank you very much. Thank you very much for first of all giving all these examples, what is happening in Tucson in Arizona, and also for alerting us of what is already happening, which is the increase of temperature in these areas in the border, and what this implies in terms of increased use of water. And also, I think of bringing your anthropological view to things, because I have the impression that we need to learn not only more economics, but mainly more anthropology, more sociology, more psychology, because at the end of the day, we're people know that we make decisions based on culture and our own thinking. Well, thank you very much. And now I would like to, before opening this for the Q&A, I would like also to have the opportunity of listening to Laureen's comments. Laureen, as was first introduced by Andrew, she's a program director for environmental change and security program precisely at the Wilson Center. So I think that probably you can also give us some of your views, some of your comments, and then we open this for discussion. So thank you again, Laureen, for joining us and for helping us this to happen.
Oh, thank you so much, Enrique. It's really a privilege to be here with all of you today. And I want to thank you for your partnership on this event. And thank you, Dr. Verity and Dr. Radonjic, for your really excellent presentations. I think that you covered a lot of ground in 20 minutes between sort of looking at the high level bilateral hydro diplomacy and then all the way down to the household level. And I think I know I'm supposed to bring some reflections in, but I actually have some questions. And so I'm going to mix it up a little bit, because I think the mark of a really great presentation is coming away with wanting to know more. So I hope you'll bear with me. Dr. Verity, I think, that was a really great, you packed a lot of history into 10 minutes and made it very accessible, and I appreciate that. One of the things that occurs to me is, thinking about cooperation over water. We know that countries are more likely to cooperate than to go to conflict over water. And we know that flexibility in water agreements is a big component of ensuring cooperation. How do you see the 1944 treaty holding up in the face of increased environmental pressures, population pressures, subnational pressures? You touched on this with the mention of the farmers pushing back on the water allocation from Mexico, but I would also imagine that there is growing pressure from some of the parched states in the West. And I wonder if there's any sort of subnational pressures on the treaty that might push for renegotiation, or, on either side, and what that might look like. And then Dr. Radonjic, it's really a fascinating sort of view of how people are making decisions at the household level. I wonder, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I wonder if you could comment on how some of that understanding could be integrated into higher levels of decision making, right? So whether it's at the city level or sort of a regional or even sort of US-Mexico relationship, but how do you take your understanding of how households are sort of what their demands are and how they're working to meet those demands, and then reflect in policy decisions that create a more sustainable environment? Sorry, Enrique, for asking questions and not
I think this is a purpose, and I think that you have the right person just in front of us to answer. So Robert, Lucero, please feel free.
All right. Well, you've asked a multi-pronged, complicated question, Lauren. And I'm going to say two things to start with. One is that to give an answer, I rely a lot on a colleague that I've had, a valued colleague for more than 30 years, and that's Stephen Mummy, who is known as the expert on the IBWC, and he's informed my opinion quite a bit. He's been a co-author on quite a few of the pieces. And then second of all, I want to acknowledge that when I was glancing through the list of participants before, I saw that the IBWC US Commissioner, Maria Elena Giner, was listening in or watching. So I have to be careful what I say, but I don't think I'm inclined to say anything she might disagree with. I think the crux of the question is, how much flexibility is there really in the treaty? And is it likely to withstand the kinds of pressures that come up from problems that maybe are of a different type than anything faced before? Is the treaty durable enough? Is it robust enough to be able to go into the future, or does it need to be overhauled? I think that if I understand it correctly, that's really what you want me to address. And my answer is that so far it's held up quite well. And the idea of the built-in procedure of constant amendment is a very smart and forward-looking idea that was built into the process. And since it's worked so well up to now, there is good reason to think that it'll continue to work. And even though there are new problems, for example, climate change was not foreseen, groundwater, as I mentioned, is still not part of the treaty. I think that with continued goodwill and continued ability to deal with problems as they come up, there are going to be ways to modify the procedure without necessarily saying, hey, we need to go back to the table and renegotiate the treaty. I know that there are interests on both sides that would like to see that happen, probably for opposite reasons. That there may be interests in Mexico who would like to see things more explicitly put into the treaty that would be in Mexico's favor. And then conversely, there might be interests on the US side that would like to see new features or renegotiated characteristics. The chances are that's not going to happen in the near future. So the chances are that we're going to continue to live with a flexible instrument that allows for built-in mobility and built-in resilience to the kinds of problems that keep coming up. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Robert. Lucero?
Yes, so great question. And I think that's one of the important questions for us social scientists and academics too. So I think how policymakers can integrate this understanding of what happens at the household level. And I think this is already happening. I think a keyword that Robert mentioned is flexibility. So there is a lot of flexibility in how programs can be redesigned. So in the case that I shared, the city of Tucson created a new program, changed its program based on its understanding of what were the needs and the priorities of its constituencies. But also what we're seeing is that a lot of the movement towards water security and climate adaptation comes from the ground up, right? So in that sense, I think about examples, for example, in New Mexico, where there have been recent changes to, I think it was the plumbing code associated with gray water collection. Gray water collection, how can you use water from your sinks, from your laundry machine in order to use it for irrigation? So again, how can we create at the household level new water sources? In order to do that, you do need to change policy. You need to change codes. You need to change sometimes ordinances that block things. So the city in conversation with the lots of activists, and also drawing on studies that show that people were interested and were already doing some of these gray water collection, have started to change their codes. So I think that once we look at the much more of the local level, we see a lot of those examples of flexibility of how there is this understanding of what households are doing and how can we use, what can we learn from there? I think we also see that at the state level. I think, for example, in the case of rainwater harvesting, the state of Utah, for example, right? And how it's changed some of its policies to allow people to collect rainwater at the residential level, whereas before it was not allowed. But one important thing to say here is that all of these understandings of what people are doing on one hand need to be integrated with a clear understanding of how that relates to ongoing environmental policies. So in this case, in order to change the legal framework, there needed to be a really good understanding of water rights law and how would they be affected or not by rainwater collection. So it's really looking at these intersections. And then the other part, for I don't know how many academics are in the audience, but I think it's important for us to think, if you are studying the household level, how can we systematically create inventories that explain and catalog what people are doing, how they're doing, and why they're doing it. So it really goes back to methodologies that can document individual relationships to water, individual relationships, experiences of water security and insecurity in a way that can be used to inform policy. So the key thing is methodology in many ways.
Thanks, Lucero. I would suggest probably you can do it, Robert and Lucero, and of course Laureen. Probably if you yourself also take a look to some of the questions in the chat. Probably you yourself would like to decide on which ones to answer. Let me just read one, but I would probably invite you to read those questions yourself, and then you decide which ones you have which ones you want to prioritize. One is Martin Rodriguez, and says, I have two questions for Dr. Varady. There has been recent discussions in the Arizona State Legislature and the governor's office about studying the feasibility of desalination plant in the Sea of Cortez. Could you provide your thoughts on this proposal? And what will be, that's one, and then what will be Mexico's suspicious of or areas of concern when addressing this at the binational level? So I mean, just pick this up because that's the one I understood, but if you yourself could also take a look to some of them and then decide.
Thank you. That's great. And in fact, I was just looking at another question here by Paul Martitla, which asks a similar question. It says that I said that Mexican authorities are averse to creating more fresh water for the binational region via desalination. And why is what he wants to know. What are the principal objections? So let me start with that. And then the question you posed that you read is a little bit broader. To begin with, it's an overstatement, and I didn't mean to suggest that Mexico has objected, because the issue has not officially come up. The person that you mentioned put it differently. He said that there is a proposal that's come out of the Arizona governor's office recently, and that's correct. There is a proposal to put money on the table to begin feasibility studies about putting a desalination plant on the coastal area in the state of Sonora of the Sea of Cortez. So as of right now, it hasn't gone further than that. There is a proposal to potentially spend Arizona money to do the study. There are definitely strong interests in the state of Arizona that would like to see that happen, because Arizona right now is dealing with a cutback on the amount of water that it's going to be getting from the Colorado River because of the extended drought. However, the amount of water that would be provided from desalination is thought to be around, and I'm sorry, I have to use this archaic US expression called acre feet. An acre is about the size of a football field, and a foot is a third of a meter. So if you imagine a football field covered with a third of a meter of water, the idea is that about 250,000 acre feet would be provided to the state if this were operational. But we're a very long way from this becoming operational. And of course, Mexico would have to agree to this arrangement, which would entail not only taking water out of the Sea of Cortez, but it would entail removing the salt from that water and having a way to deal with the salt that was taken out, the brine. And then if the water were to be physically transferred, there would have to be some sort of a conveyance mechanism, a canal or a pipeline going across the northern part of the state of Sonora. That would be a separate expense. From the point of view of Mexico, I can think of several reasons why they might think this is not a great idea. One is the environmental consequences to the Sea of Cortez, which already has serious problems, such as the potential extinction of a mammal species called the vaquita. There are only about 12 of those left.
Wow.
There are potential implications for the fishing industry, and particularly the shrimp fishing industry in the area. And there are other environmental damages that could result from the building of the plant, not to mention the use of water for the actual construction and the need for electricity to run the facility. But even more than that, some of my friends are saying that after Mexico gave up what is essentially southern Arizona and New Mexico in the Gadsden Treaty in the 1850s, it's going to be difficult for Mexico to say, well, we'll sell some water to the US for money that we have right now and permanently give up water. So I think there are concrete reasons why Mexico might look twice before agreeing to something like this. There have been a number of editorials recently in the Mexico City newspapers and in the Arizona newspaper making those arguments.
Robert, can I ask just make a question myself with respect to desalination, because that's something that at least in the peninsula and probably Sonora, I mean, you have the ocean in front, you have the Mar de Cortez, you have the Pacific on the other side, and those areas do not have any water. And so I've been involved with tourism recently, and so, but also, I mean, with agriculture. And of course, one of the main limitations is the lack of water. So desalination seems to be like the most natural option, but you also have some negatives. What will be your your balance? I mean, do you see more positives than negatives if you manage it wisely, or what is your view with respect to desalination?
I'll refer you to an article that appeared last week in Mexico City, and it was written by one of my colleagues, Rick Brusca, who's a longtime ecologist working in the Sea of Cortez. And the article ends by saying that the amount of water that would become potentially available could easily be made up by looking not at the supply side, but at the demand side, by doing a better job on conservation, by using less water, by doing some of the things that Lucero has talked about on a wider scale. So 250,000 acre feet is not considered a tremendous amount of water, even though the number sounds like a big number. And they urge people to look at the demand side of the equation instead of concentrating on the supply side.
That's a good answer. Lucero, would you like to make a comment also with respect to this question that I raised? I mean,
yes, just to add to Robert's suggestion, it's not a recent article, but I know that Jamie McAvoy, who's at the University of Montana, has been working with desal in the peninsula, and she has been looking at management and issues of affordability, right? Because one of the things that we have seen is that the amount of water that it's produced is at the end, relatively small.
Mm.
This, translating it to like normal people's speech, not that much from the plans that are already in place. And one of the challenges is who can afford it. So that's one of the things that, I mean, just as a suggestion for a reading. The other thing, just to connect to one of the questions here by Paul Martila, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, which he says that no doubt conservation measures will play a huge role in helping to avoid the most dramatic consequences of decline, but he asks about other supply questions. So in conversation with Rick Brusca's recent article, and he asked about desalination that we already talked about, but I think if we're thinking about this issue of supply, another interesting aspect, not necessarily in the binational sense as the desal case that we were talking about, but also very significant and growing in importance is the reuse of treated water, right? The recycled water. And that's something that it's becoming, it's growing. And I am sure it's going to become an important water supply source, especially for urban areas and for agricultural areas. And in that sense, it also takes us back to what I was talking before, because when we're talking about water, we have to talk about their users and who considers that water accessible. So one of the challenges that there has been with the use of these treated, basically highly treated, extremely pure sewage water is the issue of acceptability. Would people accept to drink it? So there has been a big campaign showing what is the science behind the purification process that has been going on for the last more than 10 years to try to change the laws that would allow for this water to be part of the water budget of the municipal companies, of the water municipal companies. So yes, we're looking at these other options for supply, but as we always have to think about acceptability. Will people use it? And affordability, will they be able to afford it?
Andrew, you're somewhere there, I guess. Do you have any comments, any suggestions, any reference, any questions for Robert, for Lucero, for Laureen also to comment?
Thanks, Enrique. I am here, and this is great. I'm learning so much, and both of you, Robert and Lucero, have raised some issues I certainly hadn't thought about before. So really appreciate it. Sure, I many questions come to mind. One that I saw in the chat that I'm not sure if either of you know much about. There's apparently an effort, let's see if I can find it, in Mexico City, a rain catchment initiative. So if either of you are familiar with that, that might be interesting. And a question I had in mind for Lucero was really, you talked about Tucson. It's a really interesting example. I imagine there are other cities that have made similar efforts to reuse rainwater, et cetera.
Yes. Yeah. So yes, there is there is lots of cities that are using rainwater, both for the idea of let's try to find a new water source, even if a seasonal one, or in the case of Portland and Seattle in the United States, how can we help our drainage system and avoid flooding and try to reduce pollution of the water sources. So yeah, there has been all of this experimentation with rainwater and stormwater, both in private, but also in public lands, through different forms of funding from the local level to the state level. To the question about Mexico City, I didn't see the question, but yes, there is a big program in Mexico City. There's actually different programs in Mexico City to see how is it that they can, let me backtrack here. If you go to Mexico City, if you go to Tijuana, if you go to Hermosillo, lots of people capture the rain. It's really not that complicated, right? So the question is, how can we upscale it and do it in a way that it's more secured, both for the household health, making sure you don't have algae, making sure you don't have mosquitoes, and also in a way that you can manage it for to afford some sort of household water security. So a lot of these efforts have been with how can we have the funds to support infrastructure in low-income households, and also to support the educational aspect that is associated to the management. Another part that I am not that informed and I would love to learn more is the part of the regulatory aspects. So in many places, in order for there to be a large-scale effort at green stormwater infrastructure, the regulations need to change, right? Because in a way, our gray water system had the idea that the objective was to remove water from the city. For a century, that's what we wanted to do. You wanted to remove all of this water away from the city. And now we're saying, no, 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 no. We should keep it in the city and think about it as a resource. So our paradigms of water management are shifting. But for that to happen, you need to have changes in the regulations as well.
Laureen, you want to make any comment or a reference to what you have also been listening or reading?
No, I've been learning a lot. The technical knowledge that you two bring is immense. So I appreciate the explanations for some of the more lay audience among us. I did see a question that aligns with some of the focus of our program on looking at climate-related migration and displacement. And Sebastian Rodriguez asked, as we see an increase in migratory issues due to climate change, how should hydrodiplomacy be approached at a regional level for North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean? I think that's an interesting question, recognizing that Canada, the US, and Mexico already have an agreement in place. Robert, if you could speak to sort of broadening that cooperation, and Lucero as well. Thank you.
That's a tough one, because it's very hard to attribute. And I assume when they say migratory, they're talking about human migration, not species.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, because I saw that question also. It's very hard to attribute migration specifically to environmental causes. So, because the things that impel people to move from one place to another are complicated. They can have to do with violence or economic reasons, or lack of ability to continue to farm or to continue their livelihoods. It's very hard to separate out and say that this person X migrated purely because of environmental reasons. And partly because of that, it's hard to see that there could ever be anything like a treaty to deal with that, or that an existing treaty might be modified to encompass that. In fact, I mean, the way things are in the US, it's so difficult to immigrate because they don't even accept economic reasons as a justification for wanting to cross the border. So it's difficult for me to imagine it. And by the way, I'm not minimizing the impetus that environmental causes have in propelling people to move. I'm simply saying that it's a difficult issue to pin down, and therefore it's hard to see countries getting together and specifically creating instruments to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry, Enrique, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there. I think that it's a complicated sort of set of factors that drive a person's decision to move. And so how do you take something that's so focused on water and have it integrated into that? Okay, back to you, Enrique. Thank you.
No, thank you to you, Lorraine. One thing that I was thinking while also listening to you is that we have been very diplomatic as of now. But one of the first pictures that you presented, I think, Robert, was also about the conflicts in the border. And I was not that aware about Monterrey, but I was aware in the case of Chihuahua, no? And people saying, well, you know, this water is ours. We need it for agriculture. And how are you going to be putting it back again? And we have always been listening that one of the causes of war in the world will be water. do you see that possibility happening? I mean,
Okay,
is
well, I'm
it
smiling because it's something that journalists love to tout. And a close colleague of mine, Aaron Wolf, has been working on this question for more than 30 years now. And he's put together an amazing database with a series of graduate students going back to the early 1990s, in which they've looked at thousands of cases going back to Sumerian times, so almost prehistoric times, and they've never found an instance of an actual war caused by water. So the thesis that he would propound is that there are certainly conflicts, localized conflicts. We've all heard about ranching sheep against cattle farmers and for the use of water and, shooting each other. But the idea of all-out war is really something that titillates journalists, but is not really based in any kind of historical data. So I don't see that happening. Obviously, there are major conflicts. We can look at, let's say, Ethiopia controlling the river Nile and providing less of it to Egypt, and it certainly causes conflict and major disagreements, or the same thing with Turkey controlling the Euphrates and the Tigris going down into Syria and Iraq. But these things get dealt with eventually, and they are conflicts. They cause problems. They cause economic hardship, but they don't typically lead to war.
Well, I think that's a good answer, but it's a very bad note for media, but I think it's a very good news for the world and for people. We're close to 1 hour and 10 minutes, and we usually try not to go too far from 1 hour 15 minutes. Just not to also to so that we can also keep the interest of the audience. So why don't you try to wrap up with some comments on your behalf and some final ideas? And I don't know who could.
Sarah?
Lucero, probably you can start with it.
Yeah.
Wrapping up with some final ideas. Well, I think that one of them goes back to my last point in what I said, and I think it's very important as we're thinking about how do we collaborate around water resources and how do we do it around the US-Mexico border, is this idea of how do we approach cultural differences. I think that as we continue to talk about environmental policy, this is something fundamental, not to be undermined. And then at the same time, I think as for us anthropologists who are working with people at the household level or at the community level, the key thing is how do all of these actions are also informed in the results of structures, and those structures are also the law. So really understanding it as this bidirectional path. Yes, those are my concluding remarks.
Thank you, Lucero, and thank you for being with us here tonight. Robert?
Well, that's a great segue, because I love the word bidirectional. I've used it in titles of publications, and it really does speak to the issues we're talking about. One of the things I want to leave everyone with is the idea that while we often read about serious conflict about drug interdiction and migration and the wall and all of the things that make for difficult relations between the two countries, water, for the most part, has been an exception to that. And we see lots of examples of cooperation. In fact, I recently pulled up two pictures from the internet that I was aware of a hose being extended across the wall, across the fence in Nogales, Arizona, providing water to Nogales, Sonora, when there wasn't sufficient water pressure to put out a fire. So there are examples of that kind of, grassroots cooperation that filters through to the diplomatic level, so that the two sides of the International Boundary and Water Commission can meet as equals. They have technical information, they share information, and they can actually sit down and try to resolve problems in a civil manner. And I think that bodes well. And I think I'd like to leave it with that idea that We face a lot of problems, and climate change is a massive new one that affects water security, but we have some mechanisms for dealing with these things.
That's very good. As you say, there's always potential conflict, but as long as we have the mechanisms to deal with it, well, that is how we solve the issues. Laureen?
Well, I just want to thank everybody for participating today. And Robert and Lucero, I learned a lot. I really appreciate you taking the time this evening. I think that water provides a really important entry point for thinking about how we take better care of our communities, our families, our countries, and respond to climate change pressures. And you all are doing a really immense amount of great work in this area, and I thank you both. And thank you, Enrique, for working with us together today.
Oh, thanks to you. Andrew, what can you tell us as a closing comment? And also, and again, thank you very much for this first collaboration. I think we have so many themes that we can be organizing around that probably our problem will be how to be selective and choose themes as interesting as the one that we have tonight.
And Enrique, I think that's exactly right. And it just goes to how I think this conversation about water and the water treaty and what you just said, it just reinforces how deeply integrated our societies are, and how in order to resolve issues like climate change, we absolutely have to collaborate. And the 1944 Water Treaty is one example, but the range of bilateral engagement at the federal, at the state, and the local level between our two countries is really probably like no other border in the world. And I think this conversation just reinforces how we can learn from each other and collaborate. And so I think we definitely look forward to working with you on water and all the many other issues we could handle. So thanks so much for doing this. Thank you, Robert and Lucero, for your presentations, which were fantastic.
Well, thank you all for your time. And I also like one of the sentences that I heard from Dr. Julio Frank some years ago, but probably he also heard it from you, that public policy has to be based on science, no? And so I think that the more we study, the more we disseminate information, it is more likely that we will have a better public policy to solve these issues. So thank you again for the opportunity, and thank you for the people that have been watching us. Muy buenas noches, gracias por la oportunidad, y bueno, estamos muy contentos de haber
Thank you,
tenido.
everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for being with us in this first seminar with the Wilson Center, and I hope we'll meet back again in 15 days.
Okay.
See
Thank
you
you.
later. Take care. Good night.